Over 7 years ago, I initially kept my goldfish in a 55-gallon aquarium. Goldfish are one of my absolute favorites, but more specifically the ones with natural body shapes, the common and comet varieties. They're beautiful, graceful, extremely personable, and make great pets. However, they get quite large and prefer to live in groups, and thus require a lot of space. A large aquarium or stock tank can work, but an outdoor pond is the most appropriate option. I always intended to keep mine in a pond long term, but it wasn't something I'd do until I got my own home in 2018. That's where I painstakingly made the original DIY pond. I had to dig it twice, it was overbuilt and not optimized, but it functioned flawlessly once complete. For 3 years, not only did I enjoy this pond, but the fish thrived within it. They bred and overwintered with several others that I added. That said, it all ran much longer than intended. Not that I thought it would fail, but I wanted to replace it with something larger as early as 2020. Thankfully, various circumstances stopped that from happening. Allow me to explain. Building my first pond was a lifelong dream come true. Shortly after I built it though, I became friends with the folks at Aquascape, and only weeks later I ended up with a second pond in my front yard. All of this really gave me the pond bug, and I've continued building them ever since. I had a very specific idea in mind for the DIY pond redo that Ed the pond professor was going to help me with. In fact, he came to my house to plan it out, and we intended to build it in 2021. There was an issue though. My house was just becoming too small to properly run SerpaDesign. I didn't want to waste time and money if I'd be moving soon, so we scrapped it altogether. That brings us to the summer of 2022, where my wife and I found a home that would fit the specific requirements of SerpaDesign. The second I saw the backyard, I knew it needed a proper water feature. Something similar to what Ed and I discussed years before. We began planning again immediately, and things came to a head in May of this year. Ed, along with Tim of Aquatic Edge, came to my house to finalize the vision for this design. We also went to a rock yard to hand-pick the materials. Long ago, I knew I wanted to use sandstone because of its moisture-wicking properties, which makes it great for growing moss. And as you know, I love moss. Being able to select the stones we'd actually use was an awesome experience, and I forgot just how great they were until months later when they showed up at my house. But before I get ahead of myself, there was something else I had to do. I imagined the ponds being between these decks, but unfortunately they were in rough shape. Although the materials appear new, the foundation was bad, and most of the boards were warped from not being fastened properly. I reluctantly dismantled the whole thing and salvaged what I could. However, in saying that, I don't see how we could have made this pond if I left them there. In the months leading up to this, I've been putting in well over 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. My hope was to get ahead with uploads so I could focus on the build while it happened. As you know, that didn't occur, and I've had to skip a few weeks because everything is taking longer and longer, but I digress. I mention this because in the final days before it all began is when I dismantled the deck, so even at the very start, I was already burnt out by this process. Hanging out with the dragon here to just try to get a little bit of peace for all of the chaos that's about to ensue. Planning for this has went on for well over a year, but the day has finally come, the day to break ground. I'm excited, nervous, stressed, all these different emotions because there's so many variables at play here, and you never know what's going to happen. Truly, you don't. It's already started raining in this day, and I don't know if it's going to happen as we're building. I'm sure it will because you always get the obligatory water feature rain. I've yet to build one where it didn't. Anyway, all the contractors are going to be here soon and things are being delivered and whatnot, so it's about to be crazy. And crazy it was. Before I knew it, excavators were rolling up the driveway through the rain. We marked the rough outline of the pond and began digging. It was so satisfying to finally see this happen, but from this moment forward, my backyard would never look the same. Even with the machinery, manual digging is unavoidable. You just can't do the detail work otherwise. We had to clean up the edges, remove loose areas of soil, and ensure the surfaces were all flat. This original excavation only accounted for the first shelf though. After marking for the second, we continued. Typically I do this by myself, so it was crazy to see how quickly things happened with the 5 of us. And as you can imagine, we had a lot of dirt from the excavation. Luckily we needed more height in the back and used it to regrade the hillside. Things were going well, and just as we finished the initial excavation, it rained. We had to take a quick break, but the rain wasn't going to stop us. We just had to clean up the mess and refine the edge work. The filter also began taking shape, but it was getting late and the rain started picking up again, so we called it a day. It rained all through the night, so we had to clean up a lot of water and muck the next day. This made access for the excavation kinda sketchy, so they leveled out the berm in the back for better movement. Meanwhile, Trevor and I set the skimmer. We ensured it remained level as we backfilled around the edges. We also combed through to pick out roots and loose debris and tamped out the remains. The hole was finally ready for geotextile underlayment at this point, which we rolled up and transferred to the site. Although it took a few pieces to adequately line it, a quick pass with the heat gun allows you to join them together, making installation easier. The trick though is to ensure the fabric lays flat against the dirt. Next up was the EPDM liner. It came in a single roll, making it easy to install. We just strapped it onto a pole and unrolled it over the hole. After removing the excess, we unfolded it accordingly. As before, we just ensured that it laid as flat as possible so nothing gets pinched. And as I'm sure you could tell, none of this is any different from what I've shown in past builds, it's just on a much larger scale. That said, we put another layer of geotextile over top of this. It will protect the liner from the weight of those massive boulders, which arrived just as we completed this. We pulled some of the smaller ones out first, and dumped the rest. These stones are large, have a lot of character, and some are already covered in moss. We couldn't add them just yet though. We addressed a few components in the intake bay first. Most of this space will be filled by these aqua blocks. We just had to add gravel to level them out. Another key feature was a block wall. This gravel foundation made it easy to level out the blocks. And as we stacked them, we applied adhesive between them for stability. The primary purpose of this wall is to save space and to support overhang rocks. Once tall enough, we backfilled with gravel, which meant we could finally add stones. I've never set boulders like this before, so I watched them do it for the first one. Then I helped set the next one and many throughout the project. The third and much larger rock gave us some challenges, but eventually we got it to sit properly. And to finish off day 2, we excavated a little more on the edge. The third and final day of the initial prep work began by moving one of the overhang rocks. This boulder is huge and was pushing the limits of the machine. With a lot of finagling though, we were able to get it moved to the pond. However, because of its size, we couldn't do a test fit, so I came up with the idea to make a paper template. This allowed us to determine placement, and more importantly, where to provide support. Bricks and gravel to be specific. After accounting for that though, we just weren't able to move the rock any further. And just as we admitted defeat on this one, the second round of stones arrived. Within them was an even larger boulder that, for whatever reason, Ed thought we could move.
Yeah, it's 10 feet tall. I'm saying no way. He says yes. We'll see.
I will admit that we were able to move it from this spot, but not very far. Defeated once again, we only had enough time to make a fish cave. I wanted to include plenty of these, and for this one we used an extra length of centipede tubing. We cut it to size and concealed it with fabric, gravel, stones, and a large boulder. Finally, we filled the basin with gravel and didn't work on the pond for a week. The theme of this pond was rain, and a lot of it. It may just appear like the basin filled, but this is actually mostly from displacement of water that ran under the liner. After training everything down, you can get a better look at this water bed bubble. This is not ideal at all, but the intake bay also got ruined, so we had to dismantle all of that.
Everyone's going to be here soon, so I'm going to get this thing drained down before they arrive so we're not wasting our time. The thing is though, is that as I've been looking at this for the past week, I'm getting kind of concerned with it, honestly. The thing is that once we start adding all these giant boulders in here, it's just going to get so small really quick. Basically the size of this middle area here, which, I mean, what's the point of digging this giant hole if it's going to be so small? So I'm going to talk to them and we'll get that addressed, and we're just going to have to pivot with the design.
I discussed the revisions I wanted to make with Ed before we got started, and we proceeded accordingly. That said, we still had to remove the water bubble, which was quite the process. We moved a rock and pulled back the liner to gain access to the water with a pump. Although filling a pond completely before a rainstorm would probably stop this from happening again, we added a drain for good measure. We dug a trench slightly below the depth of the pond, all the way back behind where the skimmer was. The trench houses a culvert and a PVC pipe that's surrounded by geotextile fabric and gravel. These elements, when combined with the sump pump, will pull groundwater from beneath the pond and my yard. Anyway, we filled the void with dirt and reset the intake bay to its previous state. Unfortunately though, the water bubble also damaged the fish cave, so we fixed that. I foamed various elements around this for a seamless appearance. One of which is this branch that you may remember from the 350-gallon paludarium. We had a larger excavator this time, which meant that the rock from before didn't stand a chance. Well, maybe it did because it still was a challenge, but since the foundation was there, we just had to move it to the hole. After shimming the bottom to level it out and packing gravel underneath for more stability, it was good to go. We put another fish cave under here as well. Leveling off the gravel with the block wall was also important and will come into play later. We backfilled all of this with dirt before moving on. To get a seamless look for the intake bay, we decided to use a tree. Luckily, there was a fallen oak tree in the woods that was perfect for the task. Tim chopped it down into usable pieces that we slowly hauled out of the woods. And of course we couldn't just drop it into the hole, we had to chop it down for the perfect fit. Adding stones and geotextile around this will ensure that the intake bay remains stable. I later locked the fabric in with stainless screws as well. We filled the void space around the aqua blocks with stones not only to conceal them, but also to help filter the water. Additionally, putting flow cells on top of these will ensure that smaller stones don't enter the void space. Because of everything that we had to fix earlier, we also had to redo the skimmer. We continued setting rocks as before and rough plumbed with flex PVC. We ran it along the back of the pond behind the rocks from the skimmer. Along these we connected various couplings and ball valves to create a system of jets for circulation. When connected to a pump later on, this will create jets that will ensure the pond doesn't have any dead spots. In case I didn't mention, this build is part of an educational event for Aquascape on training new CACs. We set the groundwork thus far so we could focus more on the crucial elements like the wetlands filter.
Okay, so at this point we basically have 2 days to complete the pond, today and tomorrow. We got all of the stuff down here in the basin more or less addressed. We got a few rocks to put back on this wall near where the waterfall is going to go to stabilize that. And with 40 of us, it should be an easy task to complete, but we'll see how it goes.
It was at this point that the build really kicked up and became a whirlwind. There was about 40 people, all doing different things at once. We accounted for the waterfall rocks, dug another trench for drainage, detailed the intake bay, strung lights throughout in key locations, attached the skimmer box to the liner, and set more rocks. All the while it rained, but what do you expect? A feature I was really excited about was this mossy log. I had been saving it for months, and this was the perfect spot for it. I should also mention that Tim dropped off a truck full of stumps a few days prior, which we finally started to incorporate now. We trimmed a bit off of this one to get a perfect fit. And while we're talking about driftwood, before I knew it, the boys were pulling the other end of that tree from earlier out of the woods. I did not expect that. The final features we were able to address before being rained out was some of the edge work and the section above the block wall. Using the paper technique from earlier, we checked the shape and used it as a guide to cut out flagstone. The result was a perfectly seamless look.
If everything goes according to plan, this should be the final day of building. I hope that we don't get rained out because last night we got a ton of it. It was kind of annoying, but I guess in some ways it may have worked out because it kind of rinsed off all of the rock work and everything like that. We'll certainly get more dirt in there, but as you can see, the water down the bottom is pretty dirty. So I'm running the pump right now before everybody comes to get that dirty water out of there, and the water should be here pretty soon.
Spoiler alert, we didn't finish on day 7, but it was an eventful day. It began with the placement of driftwood, followed by filling the basin. That said, I had to get in and fill it myself because the water bubble returned. This occurred because there wasn't anything to displace it. Otherwise, it would have ended up in the sump pit. This isn't quite how I imagined my first swim, but I had to get in there to redirect the water under the liner. We set up stock ponds to hold the rest of the water till later. Others prepped the patio area, ran more tubing for the pumps, and graded the hillside. We were also able to incorporate some of the plants, including a magnolia tree and a weeping cherry. I pulled a few hostas and ferns from elsewhere on my property as well. As hard as it was not to, I didn't go overboard just yet because I didn't want anything to get damaged. We were also able to finally excavate the wetlands filter. We lined the hole with geotextile just like the pond. That was followed up with EPDM liner, which I had to weasel my way out of. Of course, we put more fabric on this and assembled the pieces. This centipede and snorkel configuration creates an upflow biological system that breaks down sediments and cleans the water. We just had to hook it up to the pump, lock it in with some rocks, add a layer of aqua blocks, and finally more rocks. With that addressed, we could also move on to the waterfalls. After accounting for the shelves, we lined it all accordingly and placed the rocks. I had a very particular vision for the waterfalls, so it took a lot of work to get the stone placement just right. Details matter too. Driftwood and moss greatly helped to soften and naturalize the appearance of the edges. We applied foam in key locations as well to ensure the flow of water goes over the rocks. In the final stretch now, and things were finally falling into place. And luckily the rain gave us a break as well. The respite was great, but we were still getting stuck in the mud. This no doubt is one of the most unique elements of the entire feature, a stump with a rock embedded into its roots. We ensured to showcase it right at the top of the waterfalls. Working well into the night, we continued to add moss, stumps, and gravel. And pro tip, getting into your work is key for success. Something else I should have mentioned earlier is that when everyone found out that I like moss, they began collecting it from my yard, and before I knew it I was finding different buckets full of moss waiting for me. Although we weren't able to see the fruits of our labor just yet, ending the night with a light show was a close second. We were all burnt out by the final day, but there were only a few hours to complete the build. Everyone had flights booked for the afternoon, so we had to be done by then. The final segment of the tree was added to the wetlands, the plumbing was buttoned up, and I even pulled out the leftover aquatics from the DIY pond where I found a friend.
And we got a little friend in here, this frog, so we have a better home for him.
As we added the remainder of the water, we continued doing edge work, topped off the wetlands filter with small gravel, finished the rock work in the waterfall, and finally let the water rip. It took about 10 minutes before it made its way through, but seeing this is always so satisfying. We just had to add a few smaller rocks and chip the edge of the bottom one for optimal flow. Till then, we had been laboring through less than ideal conditions, and everyone was tired. Seeing this was the morale boost that everyone needed, and we continued to the very end. It was fitting too that one of the last rocks we set was that giant one from earlier. It, along with a few accent boulders, brought the look full circle. And just as we set those, everyone took a final look at the waterfall, we said our goodbyes, and the team dispersed. In the days after, the rain finally let up, and I was able to work on the landscape in peace. I did get a few new plants, but most of these are actually from my old house, one of which is very special to me, MJ's tree. My late American bullfrog, who I had for 14 years, passed away back in 2020. I put him under this tree at that time, but I couldn't leave it at the old house. When I pulled it out last year, I found his remains, which are now being returned to their rightful spot under this tree. I placed the statue as well when I realized that we had another friend in the mix. Frogs are very special to me. Not only are they my favorite animals, but they're literally the reason why I do what I do. Everything began with frogs. So with MJ as part of this feature, along with the new ones calling this home, it was a very special moment to say the least. Alongside these plants, I mulched and added a few aquatics that I got from my mom's pond I built earlier this year. That all happened over the past few weeks, with the date of completion being 8 days ago from when I'm uploading this. The water has cleared up significantly and will continue to do so over the following weeks. Although you did see me address some of the detail work, there's a lot more to address. In all honesty, we simply ran out of time because of weather setbacks. So I still have to address cord management, the auto doser needs installed, the flagstone patio and upper seating areas are incomplete, and this giant pile of dirt will become part of the hillside, to name a few. Even so, I did take the time to add plants. And I'm sure you could imagine that I wanted to add more, but I just have to accept that this will be an ongoing process. I have to think of this all several years in the future as a mature landscape. Most of these perennials will grow much larger and help create the aesthetic I have in mind. All things considered though, I think it looks great right now. Anyway, this is roughly an 8,000 gallon ecosystem swim pond that's 5 feet deep. The water is pulled into this area, which is called an intake bay. There's a skimmer that skims the water's surface and a pond vault that pulls water through the rocks. From here, pumps send water up into the wetlands filter, which is essentially a giant upflow bog. Bacteria colonies within the rocks will process the water alongside robust plant growth. Now, it's not that robust right now because I only have a few items, but in time it will be completely filled with plants. From there, the water cascades down through the falls and eventually into the pond, creating an ongoing loop. As stated, I had a very specific vision for this design. I wanted to mimic the types of waterfalls and creeks that I saw growing up as a kid. The features around me typically consist of pooling areas with wide blade waterfalls like these. The cool thing is that nearly everything we used to capture the essence of that was sourced locally, not only from PA, but my backyard itself. And yes, I really did just go and build an 8,000 gallon pond for feeder goldfish. The original 20 or so that I bought, most of which I still have to this day, were all feeder fish. I dismantled their pond almost a year ago, and they've been living in a stock tank ever since. Of course, that includes little Petey, who is not so little anymore. I know that many of you would expect and want me to add koi, but I'd prefer to just have my goldfish alongside something smaller like darters. I think all of these will look much better against the scale of the pond than massive koi. That said, I'm not going to add these just yet because I want the pond to become established first. When I look back on this all, I remember it very clearly. Although you get a rough idea from this video, I can't understate how much work was involved. As we labored through this, I made sure that I was a part of nearly every aspect of the build. I want to look back on all of this and the pond itself, knowing that I played a crucial role in its creation. That said, I can't express enough how grateful I am to everyone else who helped make this possible. From my friends at Aquascape, including Ed, Chris, and Trevor, and to all the certified Aquascape contractors. I can't imagine how long it would have taken me to make something like this without all of you. It's very humbling to know that all of these people traveled and dedicated their time to help make this dream a reality. There's something special about working toward a common goal that builds camaraderie, and I made a lot of new friends through this process. Additionally, I have to give a special thanks to Tim and the guys at Aquatic Edge. Since they're local, they did a lot of work behind the scenes to make this build possible. If you're located in the Pittsburgh area and want a pond, Tim is your guy. Aquatic Edge does great work, and I'll leave their details in the video description. In my wildest dreams, I never could have imagined something like this in my own backyard. Yes, it needs a lot of work, but I can't wait for you all to see it in the future after it matures, is inhabited by the fish, and all of the details are added. I think it will truly be a home worthy of showcasing one of the most overlooked and often mistreated fish in all of the aquarium hobby, the humble goldfish.